Hello and welcome to the IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zubko. Biopolitics, the study of how political power operates through the administration, regulation, and production of life itself, has emerged as one of the most generative and contested frameworks in contemporary political theory and international relations. Yet its application beyond Western liberal contexts remains under-theorized. In this interview, Professor Sergei Prozorov, one of the field's most philosophically ambitious voices, reflects on the foundations and limits of biopolitical analysis, its relationship to sovereignty, necropolitics, ideology, and what his landmark study of Stalinist life-building reveals about the affirmative dimensions of power in some of history's most violent regimes. Sergei Prozorov is a professor of political science, Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, University of Jyväskylä in Finland. His research interests include contemporary political theory, continental philosophy, biopolitics, democracy, and totalitarianism. Sergei's work is positioned at the intersection of political philosophy, IR theory, and Soviet and post-Soviet studies, with sustained engagement with the thoughts of Michel Foucault, Giorgio Agamben, and Roberto Esposito. During 2010 and 15, Prozorov held the Academy of Finland Research Fellowship with the project Biopolitics of Stalinism. During 2015 and 2019, he served as a principal investigator of the Academy of Finland project Biopolitics and Democracy in Global Governments. Prozorov's work has accumulated over 2,800 citations on Google Scholar. This reflects his standing as one of the leading theorists of biopolitics in the international field. Peer assessment situate him among the most philosophically sophisticated scholars working at the intersection of IR and continental theory. His work represents one of the most ambitious rearticulations of the ontological and ethical foundations of universalism in contemporary political theory. So let's speak about the biopolitics. I think first question could be sort of introductory, and how do you conceptualize biopolitics within international relations and political theory, and how does your understanding relate to its origins in Michel Foucault's work?
Well, biopolitics is politics of life, yes? But what does life mean? What does life stand for in this constellation? Yes, there's one understanding of biopolitics which is relatively narrow, which will understand the bio in biopolitics as pertaining to biology. Yes, so the bio is the biological, physical, natural aspects of life. All of these are somewhat different things, but nonetheless, the orientation is in that direction. So if we privilege that understanding of biopolitics, then it is a politics that regulates certain vital processes of the population and is practiced most evidently in healthcare policies, social welfare policies, education, regulation of reproduction, ambitions to regulate demographic processes, etc., etc. That's one strand that perhaps has been the dominant one. One can also interpret the bio in biopolitics from the perspective less of biology than, for instance, biography, yes, which has the same root. And here, life would be understood not exclusively in the natural, physical, or biological aspect, but in the aspect of a form of life. Yes, what is a biography? It is a specific form that an individual's life is taking, has taken, and so on. So from this perspective, biopolitics is understood wider as the regulation of forms of life in their various aspects that do not necessarily pertain only to health, reproduction, upbringing of children, etc., but also pertain to forms of life or ways of living, which are very important political categories, but are relatively vague or under-theorized. Yes, we hear very much about threats to our way of life, but we don't always know what is this way of life. What specifically in it is threatened, for instance. So that paves the way for a broader understanding of biopolitics, which has been the direction taken by the more philosophical or theoretical approaches to biopolitics after Foucault. That takes the regulation of life not only in the specific sectors or domains of health and social welfare, but also raises wider questions. What is the regulation of life? Can life be an object of government? In what way? What is regulated? Forms of life or life itself? What is life itself? These type of questions, I think, also belong to the theories of biopolitics and have been discussed quite extensively, I think, in the last 10 to 20 years. And speaking of Foucault, of course, even though the term biopolitics goes back to the late 19th, early 20th century, that's not the meaning that it is used in now. I think practically all of the research on biopolitics kind of engages with Foucault's thought, because Foucault's taking up of this term, though he didn't invent the term, he invented a rather new perspective on biopolitics, and it remains perhaps the main source of inspiration. Of course, Foucault did not discover a new domain. Yes, the practices of government that Foucault analyzed in his work on biopolitics are well known to everybody, and they're covered also by other theories from a variety of disciplines. What Foucault is analyzing is a shift in governance during the 18th and 19th centuries that has also been addressed by theories of the rise of capitalism, modernization or social modernity, the civilizing process, etc., etc. Yes, so it's not like he found or carved out a very specific domain. He offered a new perspective on the shift that has always been well known and analyzed, and he offered a promising direction in which to pursue the research on these transformations and their contemporary manifestations. So I think for the most part, the research on biopolitics remains kind of very much indebted to this Foucauldian take on biopolitics. And I find myself also returning to Foucault's text like repeatedly. Yes, always finding some perhaps minor aspects that I consider worthy of pursuit or debate. But in any case, engaging with Foucault continues to be very much part of my work.
We mentioned sort of regulation of life, administration of life. And for those who didn't hear about biopolitics before, which parties do we have? Who is actor in biopolitics? Because for the first perspective, people might think it all comes from the government, because healthcare, all those sectors, they are governed by the government. But how is it in the real life, and what sort of actors are you dealing with at your work?
Foucault formulated his first approach to biopolitics in the first volume of the book called History of Sexuality, in which the biopolitics only comes in the final chapter. Yes, but the chapter before that formulated more generally his theory of power. And in his theory of power, he makes two claims that are kind of quite profound and define largely the Foucauldian, I think, orientation in the study of politics. Power is firstly productive and secondly decentered. Yes, we can talk about productivity later, but pertaining to your question, the second aspect of decentered power is kind of crucial. that power is decentered means that it doesn't flow from a certain central point, which would be the government, the monarch, the president, the parliament, the state in general, that it flows from the top to the bottom, from the center to the margins. On the contrary, Foucault's rather famous formulation, though quite difficult perhaps to operationalize, is that power is omnipresent, but not because it embraces everything from the center, but because it comes from everywhere. So if power is decentered, power is exercised by not necessarily the state or the agents of the state, but also by people in various professions. If we're now talking about biopolitics and various aspects of it, the doctors, not necessarily employed by the state, yes, the social workers, even if employed by the state, their power and their use of power pertains more to their professional expertise and not the governmental mandate that they might be executing. Yes. So here another theme that is very central to Foucault's thinking comes in, and that is the relationship between power and knowledge. Yes. So there are various agents, not necessarily executing some sort of state policy, but executing or exercising some sort of power on the basis of their claims to know the reality that is being governed, on the basis of, in this case, various sciences such as medicine or the emerging sciences of statistics and demography, sociology, etc., etc. So the agents of biopolitics are manifold, especially in liberal democracies where the decentering of power is perhaps more easily demonstrated than in authoritarian and autocratic regimes. You can have multiple actors or subjects who are executing various governmental rationalities that cannot be reduced to a single policy emanating from the center.
Usually, when you have students, they know realism, liberalism, constructivism, all those isms, but not many know biopolitics. So what would be the main contribution of biopolitics or biopolitical perspective to approaches in IR?
Biopolitics is not a theory of international relations. Yes, it is not as such even a part of political theory. Foucault was famously, or we may say infamously, hostile to political theory, and one of the reasons was precisely this understanding of power on the basis of the model of sovereignty, which is, of course, centered and emanating from the center in a top-down fashion. So he has a very famous expression that in political practice in France, we did cut off the head of the king, but in political theory, we still haven't. So for that reason, political theory was suspect for him, or in many ways irrelevant. I mean, this might be a bit of an overstatement, or quite a lot of an overstatement. There are numerous orientations in political theory that do not employ the model of sovereignty, and pluralist political theory made exactly the same decentering argument already in the 1950s. So yes, we don't have to take Foucault's word here as the final word on the subject, but his work stands somewhat apart from political theory and political philosophy, and also perhaps by extension or by implication also from international relations theory. It is also different from the international relations theories that you have mentioned in the sense that it is not a grand theory. It is not a system. And it is not, let's say, a worldview, which in some ways realism and idealism / liberalism purport to be, which is perhaps somewhat to their disadvantage. So biopolitics is a theoretical framework which offers a new perspective on the events and practices that are as I said already, quite well known. Yes, it doesn't pretend to be exhaustive. It doesn't pretend to analyze everything at all times or in all historical periods. Basically, it takes an important historical shift that occurred largely in the European and by extension then North American societies in the 18th and the 19th century and investigates its implications for contemporary politics, also given the importance, yes, of European or Western rationalities of rule and how they extended worldwide and were globalized. It is possible to pose the question of how biopolitics operates also in non-Western societies in the 20th century or the 21st century. But the biopolitics as a theory doesn't offer any kind of hypothesis about how it would operate, whether it would be applicable or not. Yes, so Foucault himself envisioned his use of theory as a toolkit, he said. Yes, so the point is not whether his theory would be true, that it would be tested, yes, as a hypothetical deductive kind of research design would suggest, that it would be tested and found true for the time being or falsified and hence refuted. It is a perspective that can be fruitful or not fruitful. Yes, it is as a toolkit for researchers to apply and then see if it works, see what results it produces. So as a theory, it is different from those kind of grand, large system-oriented approaches that we find in IR theory, but this also means that it can be combined with them. And what matters is the type of question that you ask and what sort of puzzle you would like to explain. Yes, what sort of research problem one poses. So the theory of biopolitics, quite simply, does not stand next to realism, liberalism, constructivism, Marxism, or some other familiar IR theory as an alternative to them. But it's there as one theoretical perspective that you can take up and apply and see if it works, at the same time as you might also belong to one of those larger, more worldview or metaphysical theoretical directions.
How do you understand the relationship between biopolitics and sovereignty, particularly in light of Giorgio Agamben's contributions? Because you already mentioned the sovereignty and Foucault, so I think that might be a good example how to get biopolitics in the context.
All right, so when Foucault formulated his theory of biopolitics in the history of sexuality and in the course of lectures given at the same time, which was called Society Must Be Defended, he presented the two as different modes by which power is exercised. So sovereignty pertains to the earlier period of the 17th and the 18th centuries, yes, and the logic of sovereign power is primarily negative or deductive. This is the power that takes, yes, it takes taxes or it takes lives. So since its overall orientation is negative, traditional political philosophy emerges as the question of what could be or should be the limit to sovereignty. Because if all that it does is deduct, yes, take something, there should be some limit to the taking. Otherwise, it will just take everything. Yes. So this question about the limits to the power of the king, the state, etc., emerges as the key question of political philosophy. So biopolitics for Foucault operates differently. Its objective is positive. It doesn't deduct or take. Instead, it augments, expands, enlarges, increases, be it the life expectancy Yes, so the number of children born, it improves conditions of life. Yes, so all that it does is viewed as a positive project. And from this perspective, the question of limits becomes somewhat more complicated. If what power does is augment, expand, increase, improve, do you really want to limit it? Or is the question not really about the limits here, but about the specific manner by which it does what it does, all of those positive operations and so on? So the two rationalities of power are quite different, but it doesn't mean that biopolitics simply succeeds sovereignty and leaves it behind somehow. On the contrary, Foucault said that the three modes of power that he analyzed, the sovereign power, the disciplinary power, which is kind of a transition point from sovereignty to biopolitics, and biopower, operate at the same time and in a kind of triangle, yes, in which one form of power might prevail or be dominant at a certain period, another might come to dominate at another period, but one doesn't simply succeed the other in a kind of linear fashion. We're never done with sovereignty, just as we're never done with disciplines, but it might be downgraded in its significance. Giorgio Agamben's approach to biopolitics aims, in his own words, to complete or correct Foucault. And that's a bit of a case of false modesty, because he neither completes Foucault nor really even corrects Foucault, but completely transforms the understanding of biopower by making it indistinguishable from sovereign power. And rather than find its origins in a relatively late period, yes, the 18th, early 19th century, instead he traces it back to times immemorial, and quite literally, the first human civilizations. So instead of having sovereignty as negative power and biopower as positive power, both are conflated in one vision of some kind of sovereign biopower or biopolitical sovereignty, however you want to see it, as a power that does not necessarily want to transform life positively, but is able to capture life negatively. Yes? So the definition of this sovereign biopower in Agamben's case is that this is the mode of power that can expose living beings to death that would not be punishment, yes, and would not be sacrifice, but would be a simple negation of life. This is the famous figure of the Homo sacer who gave title to the first book and the later on long book series. So the Homo sacer is a being who can be killed without being sacrificed. He's judged guilty of a crime, but he is not immediately punished by the authorities. Instead, he is somebody who can be killed by anyone. His life is withdrawn from any protection or excluded from any protection. Yes, but he nonetheless remains there, yes, within a society. In this manner, Agamben says that the sovereign biopower operates by a paradoxical operation called the inclusive exclusion. Yes, one is excluded but still remains a part of this community from which one is excluded, with pretty bad consequences. Yes, because if you're the one to whom anything can be done with impunity, yes, without any risk of sanction, then of course you are perpetually exposed and in danger. This is a very provocative idea and an interesting idea, but it is very difficult to apply in a meaningful way in empirical research, because for Agamben, this is simply how things have been. He mentions this 14 millennia of human history. Okay? And this understanding of all power basically being identical throughout the history of human communities is what permits Agamben to make very controversial and sometimes quite preposterous claims about, for instance, the inner solidarity of democracy and totalitarianism, yes? Which makes very little sense unless, of course, you say that for Agamben, this same power, the same biopolitical sovereignty characterizes all human societies from the very first ones to emerge, and then there's simply no way that this inner solidarity would have been absent. Yeah? But if something is there by definition, then there's really not much for any empirical analysis to do. All you can do is think about whether the definition is any good. And this is where the question mark perhaps emerges.
Yeah, and sometimes it's very good to read those works, even for people who are not researching biopolitics, because there are so many interesting ideas and thoughts that also other scholars can work with. Let's go to the next question, and that's how does biopolitics relate to or differ from necropolitics, especially in the work of Achille Mbembe?
Yes, I would have perhaps a response somewhat similar to what I said about Agamben. There are lots of interesting ideas in Mbembe's work about necropolitics, but I often wonder whether the concept of necropolitics itself was actually necessary for those insights to be generated. Because, of course, from the very beginning, when Foucault was defining those two different kinds of power, he paid attention not only to the promotion of life, but also how those forms of power related to death. So famously, his definition of sovereign power was the power that made die or let live. Yes? It was negative. It produced death in the form of executions, torture, etc., etc. Or if it didn't take you up as its object, it just let you live. Didn't much care how you lived. Yeah? In a kind of simplified model of sovereign power. While biopower is the power that takes life as an object of positive interventions. So it's a form of power that makes live or lets die. So if biopower works on you positively, yes, it would make you live. Maybe better, maybe longer, but also in a certain way or in a certain form. If it chooses to ignore you, it will let you die. Yes, it will abandon you to this possibility of death. And that is what Mbembe analyzes as necropolitics. Similarly, Agamben, in his understanding of biopolitical sovereignty or sovereign biopower, views it precisely as a relation of abandonment. Power takes you up, but it doesn't transform your existence positively, but rather abandons you to the violence, literally, that can come from anyone. And that's the sad fate of Homo sacer. That's again a case of necropolitics. In fact, when you look at Agamben's approach, he almost never is interested in those positive interventions that Foucault was talking about. It's those great improvements in healthcare, hygiene, social welfare that Foucault traced in his analysis of biopolitics. It doesn't matter at all to him. What he is interested are those rather more morbid, yes, experiences of the concentration camp, the Homo sacer, and so on and so forth. So again, we have necropolitics here. So Mbembe brings in a lot more analysis of the operation of that form of power in the context of colonization, racism, etc., etc. But he basically just takes up that aspect of letting die, yes, or exposing somebody to the possibility of death that was already there in Foucault and Agamben. So I think the work contains many valuable insights, but I think that introducing a new concept of necropolitics leads to misunderstandings, as if there's some form of power that concerns itself only with death, which would be quite strange because, death basically means that the object of power disappears. It's very difficult to govern something that is dead. Yes, so most likely death is a kind of side effect, yes, or collateral damage from the politics that actually seeks to govern and dominate something that lives, which is the only object of politics. So if we understand something as exclusively necropolitical, we mystify power quite a lot because it just becomes very difficult to understand what is even the point. Yeah. But if we understand both dimensions as always working together, yes, that it's always about making live or letting die, and numerous decisions of that sort are being made in all the acts of power, then I think that would be a more productive approach.
And many of those ideas and thoughts are often abstract. And I would like to ask you, how do you approach empirical study of biopolitics, having that nature of the research?
Biopolitics does not involve any privileged methodology of its own. Of course, it is possible, and as has been done, to apply Foucault's own methods. And that is the archaeology of discourses of knowledge or genealogy of ensembles of power relations. Yes, but it's not a necessity. Yes, these methods are not inscribed in the theory in any way. So it is possible to use the whole wide array of the methods of social science or history, if one's research is more historical, together with the theoretical instruments of biopolitics. So the theory offers terms and it offers a perspective. The domain, as I said, is usually quite well known and often studied. So there's quite a lot of data on biopolitical governance if you take the last 200, 300 years of history. So you can approach it from basically any sort of perspective. If you are interested in discourses of power, then you can combine biopolitics with discourse analysis. If one is interested more in political ideologies and political rhetoric and how life figures, yes, as a rhetorical instrument, then you can do studies from the perspectives of rhetorical methodology, content analysis of various types. So I think that methodologically, the theory is quite open to various methodological applications.
Based on your practice, researching, is there any sort of your favorite method or the combination of the methods that you think that this is something that suits your research style and the outcomes you want to achieve?
Well, in different projects, I employed different versions of the methods, but I think primarily some form of discourse analysis, and again, a discourse analysis indebted to Foucault. Because my version of discourse analysis is largely inspired by Foucault's inaugural lecture at the Collège de France, which is called The Order of Discourse. And it understands discourse as an ordered space, right, of statements. So Foucault famously defined discourse as the difference between what could be said under the rules of grammar and logic and what is actually said. And those differences are understood by analyzing various ordering practices, starting from the elementary exclusion. Yes, if something is excluded from discourse as unreasonable or as false, and all the way to various restrictions of enunciative modalities, who can speak about what and in what settings. Yes? So that way we can understand precisely this difference between the sayable in principle and what is actually said in specific historical contexts of power relations. So that has been generally my version of discourse analysis that I apply.
Are there any particular cases or regions where a biopolitical framework is especially illuminating, and on the other hand, where scholars should resist applying it?
I think this is very much an open question because there is no restriction on the application of the framework because it is precisely a framework. Yes, it starts with a certain heuristic idea. Okay, so at a certain point, at least in European societies, there's been a shift in the rationality of government, and it later on spread out globally. But in what societies would biopolitics, for instance, operate differently from the European experience? And of course, the European experience is itself quite diverse, and the different political regimes applied biopolitics or biopower in quite different ways. So it's an open question. We can try to apply the theory in various contexts, and then it will really depend on the analysts and what they do with this theory, whether it is applied fruitfully. But the second part of your question is about where you don't need to go. I don't think there's a place on the globe where you shouldn't go. But there is perhaps a little bit of caution that needs to be exercised when it comes to applying biopolitics empirically, because there's a frequent misunderstanding that whenever we have the regulation of bodies or certain bodily appearances or behaviors, we're dealing with biopolitics already. But if we go back to Foucault, the operation of power on the body was analyzed famously in Discipline and Punish as essential to sovereign power. Yes, so the Discipline and Punish begins with the very long and harrowing description of the execution of a regicide, yes, who is first tortured many times over before eventually being killed. Yes, so the sovereign also applied power to the body through torture and execution, yes, in a negative fashion. Disciplinary power similarly applies itself to bodies, no longer negatively or purely negatively, but in order to make those bodies docile, more disciplined, capable of systematic work, etc., etc. So one cannot simply observe some regulation of various bodily aspects or bodily appearances or behaviors and then point to it and say, here, biopolitics. Yes, precisely because all power operates on bodies. They are the object of power. We are bodies. Yes. So the question is, what sort of operation of power on bodies is specific to biopolitics? And here we would perhaps end up sometimes, again, it's a question of empirical research, finding out that in certain societies and in certain regimes, we do not really see biopolitical government, but instead a certain combination of sovereignty and discipline. I think that that's precisely the modalities of government that define authoritarian regimes, which are not necessarily biopolitical and might not be biopolitical at all in principle.
The next question comes from junior scholars, and as a senior and one of the top voices in biopolitics in the world, what would be your recommendation for junior scholars regarding the most common errors or mistakes that you see when you read some works or perhaps some books?
That caution concerning what biopolitics is that I've just mentioned is perhaps one of such suggestions. But otherwise, my advice perhaps would be more positive. I don't want to police where people want to go, but I'm perhaps more interested in suggesting that what is most interesting about biopolitics now is whatever happens in the interstices or intersections of biopolitics and something else. Yes, I think if there is some regrettable tendency in this field in the last few years is this tendency for biopolitics research to kind of be locked in the reproduction of the same type of debates between, let's say, Foucauldian and Agambenian approaches and so on and so forth, without really extending further out and exploring the connections between biopolitics and various other areas of research in political theory more generally, and the more classical and even canonical concerns of political theory. For instance, I could bring up one question that seems interesting to me but has been relatively underexplored is the question of legitimacy in the context of biopolitics. Yes, legitimacy of power is, of course, the central, number one, perhaps, question of political theory. But what is biopolitical legitimacy? How can power be assessed as to its legitimacy when it's operating not in the sovereign mode, but in the mode of biopower? Yes, so this would be one example of addressing what is a very standard question of political theory, but from this still relatively novel perspective of biopolitics. So one should not be afraid of this dialogue, even with the most conventional approaches in political science, political theory, and international relations, if it can yield something interesting as a result.
I deal a lot with scholars and students from non-European countries, or also non-American countries, especially Africa and Asia. What's your opinion about the sort of penetration of the biopolitics into political theory discourse in that part of the world? And do people think about biopolitics as a Western concept, or do they take it as sort of universal concept that they can use without colonial, post-colonial sort of debates?
It's an interesting question because, of course, in the original articulation by Foucault, biopolitics pertained to the analysis of European societies. Foucault himself concentrated his research focusing primarily on France, yes, in the 18th and the 19th centuries, yes, before he took a sharp turn to analyze the late antiquity and early Christianity. That French experience was, for him, the main object of research. So if biopolitics were something like a causal explanatory theory, one would be wary of applying it in other spatio-temporal contexts. But it is obviously not. Yes, it's not a causal theory that one would apply in a kind of hypothetical deductive mode. It is an interpretive framework that can be basically applied even as a starting heuristics guiding research and the choice of research questions. So in this aspect, I think it works very well in other contexts precisely as a toolkit. Yes, so if we approach Foucault's definition of theory as a toolkit seriously, then there is no problem of taking up this toolkit and using the tools that actually seem to work. Yes, and in this case, you don't really have to worry about the origin of the theory. Yes, I think that sometimes the debates are quite skewed. The origin of something is always particular. There's nothing like a universal origin. But the question of application and applicability is rather dissociated from the origin. Yes, we use technological devices very rarely worrying where exactly they're made, and sometimes might even be surprised to find out where they were made. The same goes for the clothes we wear and other things. So the origin is far less important than applicability, and applicability is an open question. I mean, it would be very strange to simply state out from the outset, well, this theory of biopolitics is inapplicable outside the West. If that were shown in the analysis, somehow, then that would be itself an interesting finding. But that would be a strange finding because it would take outside the West as some sort of coherent whole, which it certainly isn't. Yes, so just as the applicability of the theory must be demonstrated in the concrete settings, so does its inapplicability or possible inapplicability. And in that case, we would already have an interesting result.
You wrote a book, The Biopolitics of Stalinism, Ideology and Life in Soviet Socialism. Before I ask more specific questions, I would like to ask you to introduce that work. What was your motivation to write it, and what sort of research outcomes you were aiming at? What was the goal of this work and research?
There were two motivations. The first one was theoretical, the other was empirical. Theoretically, Stalinism or Soviet socialism, even more generally, is a kind of strange lacuna in the theory of biopolitics. Foucault said something about the Soviet experience in his studies of biopolitics, but relatively little, and his historical claims were somewhat problematic. Agamben, as we already know, doesn't make any historical distinctions. So for him, Soviet totalitarianism kind of displays the same logic as liberal democracies, and they are both locked in this inner solidarity. Also in other later works on biopolitics, for instance, by Roberto Esposito, yes, whenever totalitarianism is mentioned, it's always the case of Nazi Germany that is analyzed as a totalitarian version of biopolitics and not the Soviet case. So there's a gap, and as usual in research process, the gap must be addressed somehow or filled. Also because if you look at the rhetoric of Soviet socialism and the Bolshevik project, the idea of building a new life, yes, and constructing a new Soviet person has been very central to the rhetoric. Yes, so it is in some ways a biopolitical project par excellence. Yes, but a biopolitical project of a somewhat different orientation because it doesn't claim to follow or emulate anything like human nature, but ventures, on the other hand, to transform it radically, negate what the human nature was before and produce a new kind of human being that would be that new Soviet person. So the logic of this biopolitics is not naturalist like it is in classical liberalism, for instance, but constructivist. So that was yet another reason to engage with the Stalinist period of the construction of socialism, which was perhaps this greatest biopolitical assault on the existing reality in the name of the world and the reality to come. The second reason, as I said, was empirical, and that concerns the contemporary period, and perhaps less even today's period than the time when I started that project, which was around 2010, where one could observe in contemporary Russia a very strange example of a re-Stalinization that was entirely devoid of any ideological proximity to Soviet socialism. Stalin was rehabilitated not as this great creator of the socialist reality, characterized by the forced industrialization, collectivization of agriculture, etc., but in a very specific manner that would have been perhaps strange to Stalin himself and Stalinists of the time. And that is, in the words of a rather infamous new textbook that was published around 2010, an efficient manager. Yes, very strange characterization of Stalin. So the argument was that despite all of the tragedies, all of the terror, all of the errors, all of the disastrous aspects of the Stalinist project, Stalin was nonetheless an efficient manager who created a new society. Yes, he inherited an old agrarian country and left us with a new Soviet Union as a new type of society, new type of state governed by the Communist Party, etc., etc. So it's not very clear what exactly does the efficiency consist in and what is the management that is being employed here. So I started out with this puzzle and kind of worked backwards to see what does kind of biopolitical take on Stalinism tell us about this, let's say, less ideological aspect of his rule.
Let's talk a little bit about the Soviet ideology regarding this book. How do you treat the Soviet ideology in the book, and how biopolitics help to explain was the sort of certain mode of life as in the book?
One way to understand Soviet ideology would be to apply to this ostensibly Marxist project Marx's own critique of ideology as false consciousness. The problem then would be if this Soviet ideological edifice was merely false consciousness, then what did this false consciousness conceal? What was beneath it? And there were some studies that basically said that, well, what was beneath the whole Soviet ideological edifice was just the process of economic modernization and industrialization. There's nothing else to it. Yes, but then there are numerous puzzles. Why couldn't this project of modernization and industrialization be undertaken without this massive ideological investment and tremendous sacrifice in the name of this ideological edifice? Yes, one could modernize and industrialize just like many other late industrializing countries did, who did not require any such ideological edifice to be constructed. It just seems to be a bit too wasteful and redundant. On the other hand, it would be perhaps also premature and simplistic to simply say that Soviet ideology had some sort of almost magical powers of transforming reality, so that the reality of life in the Soviet Union somehow coincided with this ideological discourse. That would be the danger of some kind of pan-discursivist, if you like, approach, which is problematic in various ways. So instead, I think the Soviet ideological project can be grasped from a biopolitical perspective as a programmatic attempt to transform society, which did have evident real effects, yes, such as the collectivization of agriculture, yes, which did take place in just 5 years, the forced industrialization, etc., etc. However, this project, which in the Soviet rhetoric of the time was known as the Great Break, yes, that's the policies undertaken from, let's say, 1928 to about 1934, yes, was not the last word on Soviet biopolitics. Yes, yes, indeed, some of the objectives were realized in practice: the industrialization, the urbanization, collectivization of agriculture, but the violence at work in this project, the violence of negation of earlier forms of life, be that of peasants owning land, the so-called kulaks, or the remnants of the bourgeoisie or aristocracy, this violence led to this whole project of the Great Break undergoing three kinds of negation that I discuss in the book. So the first one is the process which was traced precisely to 1934-35, and that is known as the Great Retreat. In the post-war research on Soviet socialism, this phenomenon of the Great Retreat was developed by Nicholas Timashev. So what is this retreat? It is basically the restoration of hierarchies in social life, very much emulating some of the hierarchies of the Tsarist past, in at factories, in the army, at schools, at universities, etc., etc. There's a remoralization of Soviet society. Divorce is made much more difficult, abortion is prohibited, etc., etc. Yes, so the society that was to be transformed through this violent onslaught of the Great Break now is stabilized by stepping back from some of the most extreme kind of ideological slogans and projects. Right? So right after the Great Break, you have the Great Retreat. The second negation took place in the aesthetic realm, which was, of course, ideologically colonized thoroughly by that time. So it's sometimes hard to tell aesthetics and ideology apart. And that was the introduction of socialist realism as the official kind of aesthetic norm or ideology. Sometimes socialist realism is understood as more broadly as covering the entire kind of Stalin period, which is relatively or quite incorrect, because the culture of the Great Break period was very different from what followed with the introduction of the socialist realist normativity. For instance, the so-called productionist novel celebrating those violent drive of industrialization was closer in many ways to the avant-garde literature than it was to the rather saccharine melodramas of socialist realism. Yes, partly because it was utterly unreadable. It was replaced eventually by socialist realism, which would have been more in accordance with the broad tastes of the masses. So socialist realism infamously represented revolutionary reality in its process of being accomplished. What it meant, it represented the Soviet reality as if it were already accomplished, even though it wasn't. Yes, so this is why it had very little to do with realism, but a lot with socialism. And the way I understand it is precisely as a negation of the Great Break project that basically says something like, okay, we haven't succeeded in really transforming life, so let us at least transform it thoroughly on the canvases and the pages of the books and in theater, etc., etc. It's a simulative project. Yes, what it creates is a simulacrum of the life that doesn't exist, but because it's everywhere. Yes, it is looking at you everywhere, from the posters on the buildings as you walk around, from the theater, the books you read, the radio, etc. It basically crowds out existing reality. It effaces the existing reality in favor of its aesthetic representation. And the third negation was perhaps the most strictly negative of them all, and that was the Great Terror. Yes, that started in 1936. So all of them after the first 5-year plan and the kind of completion of the Great Break. So there's quite a lot of literature on the Great Terror and how it differs from other aspects of state violence, of which there were no shortage during the Great Break. Yes, the violence of collectivization is perhaps more horrendous in terms of simple aggregate numbers than what happened during the Great Terror. But that violence had some sort of an objective that could be grasped. Yes, it pertained to the goal of transformation. And that is why this violence at least claimed for itself some kind of redemptive and transformative function. When a former kulak was sent to the concentration camp, he was not there to be simply punished or killed, but ostensibly to be reforged, as a favorite ideological trope had it. Yes, you were to be reforged, transformed, so that you would eventually end up a proper Soviet citizen, one of those new Soviet persons that were meant to be created. Now, in the Great Terror, that objective was almost entirely taken off the agenda. And very interestingly, many of the targets of the Great Terror were the people who already were in the concentration camps at the end of the 1920s. But the reforging kind of didn't work. So now they were there again, this time without the objective of reforging and with the consequent loss of life in the camps reaching, again, enormous proportions. The Great Terror had no rationality of a transformative kind. It was more of a revenge on the reality that resisted transformation. Once we couldn't transform the reality entirely, let us then destroy, quite literally, by exterminating those who conflict with the image of reality which we have posed. So there is the biopolitical project of the Great Break, and then there are three negations, immanent negations from the inside, which ultimately conclude that as such, the project of the construction of socialism was very ambivalent. You cannot count it as a success and present Stalin as an efficient manager, because it ended up negating itself in three distinct ways, all of which betrayed the early ideological drive of the Great Break, and the Soviet society that emerged from them carried the traces of those three negations just as well as it carried the objectives of the original policy of the construction of socialism all the way to its very end.
Based on your research, is it possible to distinguish between biopolitical investment in Soviet life from cynical propaganda?
From what I already said about socialist realism, we could perhaps see this example as perhaps that kind of relation that you are suggesting. Yes, on the one hand, there is the project of the Great Break that would correspond to this biopolitical investment. Yes, it's an attempt to produce new forms of life by negating, quite literally, forms of life that are deemed to be ideologically dying or obsolete. Yes, which is again a term from the official rhetoric. So that would stand for this biopolitical investment. I would not necessarily call it affirmative, yes, because the project was very much about negation. The new forms were meant to crowd out and replace the old forms. Yes, they were not added as something else to coexist with the old. That would be my understanding of a more affirmative approach, where you augment what exists by adding new forms to old form. When you replace the new by the old by the new, then of course you're no longer dealing with something which is purely affirmative or positive. But then when you have this doctrine of socialist realism, which presents the socialist reality as already attained, even though it is not yet attained, then you are dealing with this what you have called propaganda. Whether it is cynical or not, I do not know. In some ways, you could say it was an honest attempt to somehow come to terms with the difficulties of actually crowding out old forms of life and replacing them by the new. And because it coincided with the Great Retreat, you could say it was in some way a cynical attempt to mask the retreat. So as we have old hierarchies being reestablished, where do we have this egalitarian society which we talked so much about? Well, there we have it. Go to the museum, you'll see it on the canvases there. Or read some Soviet social realist novels. There, this society is already there, is already accomplished, even though in reality, what we're dealing with is the retreat from all of those egalitarian projects of the post-revolutionary period.
The last question for today's interview: what are you working at the moment on regarding research? And perhaps is there any new book on the horizon?
What I'm currently working on is the relation of biopolitics to the current debates in philosophy and social sciences on realism. Not political realism or international relations realism, but more philosophical realism or ontological realism, though that would have implications, of course, for political realism as well. I think one of the problematic areas of some of the research on biopolitics has been a somewhat uncritical adoption of a kind of constructivist methodology that takes Foucault's theory of the productivity of power, that power produces reality in a simplified way, and methodologically applies it, and since the object of its analysis is usually discourse, it methodologically qualifies this theory by saying that discourse, the discourse of government, produces reality. So it takes governmental discourses as somehow directly efficacious in the production of the reality that they govern. Now, in many ways, Foucault can be read in that way, and some of his formulations perhaps lead one to this type of conclusion. But that would be a rather problematic approach, yes, because if we see discourse as directly constitutive of reality, this is not in itself something very unheard of. Yes, one immediately recalls, for instance, speech act theory, yes, where performative speech acts are indeed directly constitutive of a certain reality. Saying, I now pronounce you husband and wife, transforms the couple into a married couple. Yeah? But this direct efficacy takes place in only very specific settings with the very specific procedures where those speech acts must be uttered by specific persons, etc., etc. There is a whole doctrine, yes, of infelicities that John Austin developed in order to demonstrate how those speech acts can always go wrong unless following very specifically the procedure by which they are efficacious. But if that type of procedural approach is not taken, one very easily grants efficacy to governmental discourse as such, so that when we read programs on transforming reality, we start viewing reality as already transformed by those documents, which is evidently not the case. So in recent years, or maybe a decade or two, there have been a lot of developments regarding new versions of realism. Yes, sometimes called continental realism, sometimes positive realism, speculative realism, and so on and so forth. So in my current research, I would like to, again, work in the interstices, as I usually do, on the intersection of those approaches and see what can be made of rethinking biopolitics from a more realist rather than a more constructivist perspective.
Professor Prozorov, many thanks for sharing your research insights and your perspectives on biopolitics. It is a fascinating topic and I think very interesting for many junior researchers, also students, to work with something different than the classical theories. And as you said, it's not a theory, it's a toolkit which we can use in combination, which is even better. I wish you good luck and lots of energy with writing your research. We will be waiting for the new book and new research papers. And many thanks for being on the IR Thinker.
Thank you. Great talking to you.